Good morning, everyone. I'm delighted you're here with us today, with me today. And my talk today is entitled Ingenious Mind. And I don't often do this, but I'm starting with a quote from Romans. I don't really recognize the back part of the Bible so much. Anyway, it says, "Do not imitate the way of this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your minds, that you discern what is good and acceptable and perfect the will of God." I think that's pretty apt for that idea of mind that I'm presenting today. And, our founder, Ernest Holmes, who wrote The Science of Mind Teaching, created this teaching, his use of the term mind is also very ingenious, because the mind in the science of mind is kind of an all-encompassing term that covers everything from one's personal mentation to this collective thinking or race consciousness to the great mind of God. And mind refers to the creative medium, and that is known as the subjective mind, through which thoughts and feelings and ideas manifest and demonstrate, actually come into our lives and our being. Mind refers to an all-knowing intelligence that is part of all of our individual minds. I, you, we are all part of the great mind of God, and therefore we all possess that potential of God's wisdom and God's intelligence all the time. Mind refers to all of those gross sensory systems. We had a beautiful guided meditation earlier that illustrated what comes up for sight and sound and taste and touch and smell. So that's part of mind as well. It also includes those subtle sensory systems like intuition and inkling, that feeling that people sometimes get in their gut. And mind makes itself known, God makes itself through mind by way of ideas. So those ideas that come into our heads, that come into our brains on some level, that is a direct communication from God. That's God being activated in you. And mind refers to feelings, those inward sensations that are the very qualities of the divine, that they're having their way with you, that God is being that quality of love or joy or well-being or abundance or fulfillment or compassion, just to name a few. That is living spirit living through you. And mind refers to the intelligence of emotion, of that movement of music, of math, of nature, of relating, of listening, of art and literature. All those intelligences are also part of the great mind of God. Mind refers to the thinking of the world around us, known as race consciousness. Often comes with a negative connotation, but that's just sometimes, not all the time. Sometimes the thinking of the world around us is ingenious. It is genius. And the great mind of God is duplicated in you and me, for we're made of that God stuff. That same spiritual DNA is in, through, and around all of us. And as one opens to this potential, as one taps into the mind of God, you and I can think as Spirit thinks. And when we are aligning ourselves to that idea, we are aligning ourselves with the highest idea, that vision for our lives. So science of mind is quite an ingenious mind. Now, I've often heard on my journey this aphorism that says the longest journey one must take is the 18 inches from head to heart. Has anyone had that particular experience? Me neither. I know some of you raised your hand, but I haven't, I have to tell you, because, and maybe somebody can explain how this works later. But I've heard this many times in my spiritual journey, and it stings a little when people say that. They might say, well, RevKev, you're all in your head about this. You're all in your head in this matter. And it's usually after I've shared something that is a principle that I've learned or a truth that's been revealed for me. And I've not really had this experience of the head being separate from the heart, and then it spreads from the head to the heart somehow in this kind of tangled hierarchy. And it's really a tangled hierarchy for me that's not worth untangling. But it is worth unifying, and it's unified beautifully in this teaching. So, when people say that, from my perspective, when they say I'm all in my head, it's kind of the left-handed compliment maybe. And then it maybe has a little sting of judgment to it. So I try to avoid that personally, but it implies that, even though I'm relating something that I've developed intellectually, I have an understanding of it, I'm able to share it on some level, that it's not enough, that it's not complete in some way. And I'm just not really sure how helpful that mentality is. But I turn it around. I turn it around and I say, it's a blessing that this is in my head. It's a blessing that it is that apparent in my conscious thinking. So what better way to embrace a spiritual principle than in the head? In the mind. For me, this is where it works best and it works most enduringly and most thoroughly. Even if the principle originates from some other aspect of mind, be it from feeling or intuition or emotion or heart, once it can be articulated in mind, it has a whole new possibility. It has a whole new potential. In mind, it is more likely to be related. It is more likely to be shared. It is more likely for it to cross-pollinate, to duplicate, to flourish in new and greater ways. Now, remembering, too, that being guided and guarded and protected is a character, is a quality of God, a quality of the divine. I'm aware, and I'm included in this, that some folks appear to be guarded around their emotions. They seem to be not as emotionally effective as we expect or intend for them to be in our judgment. Well, what I've learned is that people choose not to be fully emotionally expressed at certain times in certain situations, and I respect that choice because it's not always the best choice to be fully fledged emotionally over the top all the time. There are instances where that might not be the best thing. While it is vitally important to glean the full measure of one's emotions, it may not necessarily be right now, right here. It might be a little bit later in another spot. But it still is part of everyone's growth. So for me, I'm a person who managed to pretty much stuff any emotional expression in my life up until about 20 years ago when my emotional dam burst. And so I'm sure no one has had this experience. I hope nobody's had this experience because it wasn't fun. But at that point, I was in a kind of emotional runaway. From no emotion to emotional runaway, you can imagine the shock and the fear that I was feeling at the time. But I really began to learn some basic things about emotions. First was that my emotional expression was not always the most appropriate thing. So my blubbing on about something bad in my life with my friends in a restaurant, that was probably not the best choice at the time. And then I learned really quickly, everybody's really uncomfortable here. Maybe this is a more private experience for me than something that should happen right here. So I learned to be a little more careful about those situations where I choose to be and make sure that I have that sufficient ability to reschedule. So that's the next thing. I learned that I could reschedule those emotional experiences. And I learned that, I could wait a few moments, maybe till I'm in the car or maybe till I'm at home. So it might be a few minutes later, a few hours later, but I go back and I revisit that experience and notice what comes up and relive those emotions because those emotions have some valuable information. And all those appointments with my emotions, I realize, are all kept, one way or another, whether I admit to it consciously or not. All those emotional appointments, they're going to happen now or later or a lot later, sometimes with interest. Oh, that's not a good one either. But those appointments are all kept. Now, mind you, this is all coming from this what I now consider to be a little bit distorted point of view from a self-proclaimed expert in 100% emotional suppression. So my worldview was one of stuff it. So you can see now I'm awakening to what I would consider most folks already have, this more healthy, I'll say, idea and experience and expression of emotions. And I knew nothing of emotions but to stuff them. But when that dam burst, a whole lot of emotional learning came upon me pretty quickly. Now, at times, folks like me simply are not that emotionally skilled. I'm still trying to figure out the most effective expression and experience, ways to have that be more meaningful in more arenas in my life, because those emotions are part of the ascent of spirit within the individual. So we often talk about how an idea or a thought impressed upon the subjective outpictures in the world. The cause, the thought, through the subjective medium creates the effect. Seed, soil, plant. But it also works the other way, where the plant, the flower, works back through the subjective to reunite and reaffirm that conscious quality or idea. And emotions are that very powerful thing that ascends the spirit within the individual. So that's why I give it a lot of importance in this teaching, and it's something that's been a real gift for me to understand that aspect of it. Now, I have to admit that, I'm probably about, at this point, as emotionally skilled as a 12-year-old, but then again, a lot of women might say that about all men. So I might be on target. But I do have an intention to grow, and therefore I am learning all about, as much as I can, emotions and how they contribute to my well-being. Now, as I've said, from a science of mind perspective, feelings are causes and emotions are an effect. And emotions are something that one has a certain amount of choice around. And emotions are learned. There is a certain art to emotional experience and expression. And emotions are intelligent. There is a message in every emotion for you and me. The emotions are powerful. They have with them. We can feel the emotions actually transforming our bodies. They move in waves and through our being, and things change. And there's a physicality to those emotions. So there's a power in them to shift right down to that cellular level. They're an essential part then of that unfoldment, of that revelation of spirit as spirit beings that you and I are. And therefore emotions have within them this sort of healing and transformational power that one harnesses to propel one's spiritual transformation and growth at all times. Now, it is kind of a slippery slope, I got to point out, to make any kind of an assumption about whether someone's in their head or their heart, because, I'll say this many times, only I can know what's going on inside me. You might have some ideas, some assumptions, some guesses about what's going on inside me, but I'm the only one that can really know that. So if you are called to make such a comment, because that can be an important role in the interplay between beings that fosters each other's growth. So if you are inclined to do that, what I encourage you to do is to reframe and rephrase that kind of questioning. You might say something along the lines of, I'm just not catching what you're pitching, or I'm not really believing what you're saying or understanding what it is that you're saying. Or I think that there's something out of whack, there's something out of integrity as you're presenting this idea. You might be at cross purposes, saying one thing and doing or meaning another. You might be displaying some obvious inner conflict. You're talking about something that's really challenging and sad, and you're smiling. That would be a sign that something's not really jiving internally. And how often do you hear it the other way around, too, that you really have this in your heart but not in your head? And you do say that, we hear that phrase, well, their heart was in the right place. You hear that expression, right? And it assumes that one naturally knows or obeys or follows this, sort of tangled hierarchy, but it's all part of mind. It's all part of the one mind, and it doesn't really matter which comes first or second. It's all a function of spirit revealing more of itself through and to you. So having laid out that encompassing nature of mind, and that the head and heart are all part of mind, the original title of this teaching was The Science of Mind and Spirit. It wasn't the science of mind and heart. And I think fairly well established, too, that the science part of the science of mind has to do with the scientific method. Holmes said, and he was really restating some ancient sort of Hindu, Eastern, Buddhist principles, saying, here are these principles. If you put these principles into practice through spiritual practice, and those spiritual practices are things like meditation and prayer and journaling and affirmation and visioning and doing spiritual study, being of sacred service, seeing your spiritual counselor, your practitioner, tithing, and coming here to church on a Sunday and being part of the beloved community. Those are all spiritual practices that are helping each and every one of us more fully embody, activate, live spirit. And this is really what the great mystics were saying and have said for millennium, that you prove this to yourself And as you prove this to yourself, that beneficent presence that some call God, some call living spirit, some refer to it Yeshua, Buddha, Allah, whatever it might be, that you prove to yourself that that is part of you, that is your birthright, your being. And as you immerse and embrace these teachings through those spiritual practices, that is the science part of the science of mind. Now, Westerners are often inclined to associate mind with brain and brain activity. We do that a lot. And, scientifically, the brain's still kind of a mysterious organ. And I would say, we in the West, on a scientific basis, probably have the most to learn about brain and mind. Eastern medicine has had a more happy balance or marriage between the metaphysical and the physical, the whole being. And therefore, I think that this is a more common occurrence in the Eastern teaching to notice that mind is an all-encompassing thing, whereas in the West, we want to subdivide it down into the liver and the lungs and the heart and the skin and the skeleton and the muscles and the brain. And but what we do kind of know about the brain up to this point, and most people agree, that conscious thought only uses about 10% of this brain activity. Now, that conscious thought, though, is really important because that is the primary arena of human soul growth. And does that mean that the other 90% of your brain is just kicking back, enjoying all that oxygen and nutrient-rich blood? I don't think so. I think it's just the opposite. That other 90% is the foundation upon which we can have that 10% of conscious activity and still be the high-functioning beings that we are. Now, there is much power in that, even in that 10%, and one of the powers it has is to be its own witness. Human beings have this gift to be able to notice who we are and what we're doing, and have some kind of an assessment, evaluation, discernment, maybe even judgment around it. Don't notice many other plants or animals that have that particular ability, at least not from our frame, not from our perception. So that is a very, very important capacity. It's a gift of this incarnation that you and I have to propel ourselves through it, to elevate our consciousness on ever higher levels. Now, I love this show on the Discovery Channel called Ingenious Minds, so you can see where I got my talk title. And it features people that have an unusual combination of challenges with some particular gifts. And these kind of folks were sometimes generally referred to as savants. Now, one of the shows features Temple Grandin, and she's one of my heroes, one of my favorites. And you might know her as a scientist who transformed, that grew and morphed beyond what had been diagnosed as severe autism in her life. And she is a best-selling author. She is an in-demand scientist and consultant for animal and animal sciences. And it wasn't that she cured her autism, but she was able to morph it, to transform it, and to use the gift of her unique perceptions to actually create groundbreaking research in that area of zoology and animal sciences. And what struck me right away about the show was that they took a tack that didn't sit right with me. And that was that they kind of looked at these folks as broken. They looked at these folks as they've got these huge challenges that are very different than the average person, yet they are able to produce these fantastic, whatever it might be, research or creations or art or whatever it might be. And there's a full range of all different experiences these folks have. And right away I thought, nah, this is really the other. And their research into these, looking at brain scans and trying to diagnose them and everything, all hinged around a broken person, a person that wasn't complete. And it just didn't sit right. No. These are whole people. All of us are whole people. All of us are whole beings. And these folks just have a slightly different set of features. They have a slightly different set of gifts. So all of us have gifts. None of us have the same set of gifts. And that's true about these folks too. And the show actually bore this out. So what they noticed as they started to do analysis of these particular people was that they weren't so different than you and I. Yes, they had some challenges, but they had brain activity that far surpassed the average person's brain activity. So it wasn't that they were broken in any way, it was that they were fantastic in a very important way. So it is kind of comforting to know that we're all capable of that kind of greatness because we're all encoded. What is true anywhere is true everywhere. That's a basic metaphysical principle. So if one person can exhibit this great contribution and accomplishment in the face of enormous challenge, or in the face of the medical community saying no, 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 in the face of all that, these people have overcome and accomplished great things. That means you and I, no matter what that challenge might be, are also capable of accomplishing great things. In various points in Temple Grandin's life, she was abused, tormented, ridiculed. She was written off many times by the educational world, by the medical world, institutionalized. She was minimized and marginalized. But with the help of a few individuals, and now we see the good of God flowing through these helpers, through these caregivers. So this is all a unifying experience again of this idea of mind. Through the help of those individuals who saw beyond any kind of challenge, that didn't see a broken person but saw a whole and complete person, she was able to succeed and really thrive. There are some cutting-edge issues in mind research that just blow my mind. So the first one I want to talk about is target fixation. You've heard this term before, yes? And the reason I bring these up is because they have a direct parallel to us on our spiritual path here, at least that I feel. Well, target fixation is when a pilot, a fighter pilot, gets so fixed on the plane that they're attacking that they tune out perhaps another plane coming in to attack them from this side, or another target that would be easier to pick out, or the mountain that they're going to fly straight into because they're so focused on that plane. So how often do you and I get that? We've zeroed in on something that we think is our good. We've got our target in our crosshairs, and we're so tuned out to anything else that God can be sending us all kinds of gifts and good in all these other ways, but we're so tunneled in and tuned in on this thing, we're not open to receive it. So that's target fixation. But the other one that is very, very interesting is this idea called inattentional blindness. Have you heard of this term before? This is one of my favorites. This is when one is looking at a variety of things. So target is one thing to the exclusion of many others. Inattentional blindness is looking at many things to the exclusion of one thing. So there's a famous experiment that's been repeated many, many times in that they show an audience of people a videotape of basketball practice. And they ask the people in the audience to count how many times the ball gets passed from player to player to player to player. Now, in the middle of this video, a man in a gorilla suit walks into the middle of the frame, holds his hands up, pounds his chest, and walks off. About 90% of the audience will not have seen the gorilla at all. And it wasn't in the back, it was right in the front in the midst of all this other activity. And this we refer to as inattentional blindness. So again, this is excluding that one thing because we're looking at so many other things. So it is that idea sometimes to be single-minded of purpose, to be single-minded of focus. And of course, in our teaching, that single-mindedness means to be single-minded of focus and purpose of God, of living spirit, always. But it is fascinating how this research begins to converge and how it has a very distinct parallel to metaphysics, to something spiritual, to the science of mind teaching in specific. So the science of mind then is that all-encompassing organ of knowing or gnosis. One can know something in their mind, usually a brain-oriented knowing, or one can feel it. People often say they know, they feel, they sense it in their spine, or they feel it in their bones. They're beginning to affirm this kind of knowing more and more in mainstream science. And we all know it very familiarly. It's very common to us, but it's interesting that it becomes affirmed in another kind of way, and I think it really supports me and it supports this teaching. And, as Howard Thurman said, and it's the title of his autobiography, of Head and Heart. So I encourage you to embrace the totality of mind, the all-encompassing nature of divine mind, which is all there is. I encourage you to shed any smallness or limitation and begin to explore the realm of infinite possibilities and unlimited potentials. This is the mind of science of mind. This is your mind now. open to those infinite possibilities, open to those unlimited potentials. So let's turn together in prayer. So just calling to mind, calling to heart, calling to all those sensory systems within the being, that presence, that power, that intelligence, that compassion, that love, and know that that is all good, that is all God. That is God, that is living spirit. And that living spirit is joyfully extending, expressing, experiencing itself in new and fantastic ways. It is a God that loves so much, that is a God of plenty, that extends itself into this plane of incarnation. And knowing that God then is everywhere equally fully, in, through, and around all people, places, things, I know that I am one with and one of this God. And knowing what is true for me is true for everyone, I know that we are all one with and of God. That within us and surrounding us is that love, that intelligence, indeed that great mind of God. We are that meditation in the mind of God. And therefore we are filled to overflowing with all the intelligence, the creativity, the qualities, the feeling, the love, the compassion that God is. So I speak my word that each of us now is more open, more accepting of this aspect of mind. That each of us now is more receptive to intelligences in all those forms that are happening right now in you and me. I speak my word knowing that those potentials, those possibilities are realized more easily, more frequently, more gracefully, and more gratefully as we embrace this idea of mind in the science of mind, knowing full well that each attempt, each practice, each meditation, each affirmation, each prayer, each study, each counsel, each tithe, all of that contributes to that greater realization, that greater activation of the good that God is through you, to you, as you, and surrounding you. I'm just so grateful for knowing this truth. I am so grateful to share this idea, this feeling, this concept, this teaching. And I bless the world as I am blessed, as you bless the world as you are blessed, circulating God's good in ever greater, more magnificent ways. And for that I give great thanks, and I lovingly release all of this into the law of mind in action, to that creative, subjective mind that responds to the thoughts, the feelings, the impress of my words, our thoughts, right here and right now. That each of us has a happier, more peaceful, more loving existence right here and right now. And together we say, and so it is. Amen.